So we're here to have a sort of an intimate conversation with Pia De Jong, with special attention to her writing and the influence of the sea and water in her writing and that of other writers. We could really have it one at a time with her, but I thought it would be fun to get up here and Pia would do some reading, and I will ask her questions, and we can obviously have questions from all of you. But what should you know before we talk? Firstly, that Pia is a late bloomer as a writer. She had 2 earlier careers as a therapist and a business consultant, and she liberated the writer in her in only the last 10 years. In that time, she's written 2 novels. One is called, interestingly for this series, Fear of Depths, 2 books for children, many short stories and magazine articles, and many newspaper columns. 3 years ago, she was raising 3 children in a 400-year-old house on a canal in Amsterdam. And then everything turned upside down for her. Her husband, Robert Dijkgraaf, was offered a job to be the director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. So Pia found herself in the unusual position of being a writer who had been shipwrecked. She was in a new country and had to find her voice in a new language. And 3 years later, she has in fact done that, with a little help from Hurricane Sandy, which I hope she will tell you about later. Moreover, you can read all about her life every week on the back page of the newspaper in Amsterdam, NRC Handelsblad, leading daily there. Just about everyone in Amsterdam reads her column. It's called Flessenpost, or Notes in a Bottle. But since her first Flessenpost appeared, 3 years ago, she has written 160 columns in 160 weeks. So she has missed not a single week. I don't think any other columnist in the world can say that. Pia stands in a long tradition of European writers who've come to the United States to report on the doings in this strange country. These include everyone from Alexis de Tocqueville to Alistair Cook. And the common theme that runs through her work and in her columns and her early careers as a therapist and consultant is her deep interest in human behavior. Now, Pia was born and grew up in Roermond in Limburg in the south of Holland. And there, the experience of the sea, even though she was somewhat inland, and the water is in her DNA. Her father was a water engineer who was called into service during the North Sea flood of 1953. Her brother is also a hydraulic engineer, and her husband's last name, Dijkgraaf, literally means dike warden, or chair of the water board. It's a medieval phrase in origin, which tells us something about how long the water and the sea have been prominent in the Dutch mind. And water is an ever-present metaphor in the work of Dutch writers. In Pia's writing, water is often a symbol or a metaphor for change and healing, not of the ferocity of nature raw in tooth and claw. And as I suspect you have heard in previous programs in this series, the interesting place in Holland, at least to me, is the in-between land, the floodplain between the dike and the stream bed, that gives the water a place to go when it floods. So by cooperating with the sea, the Dutch have found a better solution than the Army Corps of Engineers did in the Missouri River, where they basically channelized it, or in the New Orleans Harbor, where they channelized it and just made the conditions that led to the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. A few other factoids. This year, Pia has published 2 stories in English, her first, in the past 3 issues of the Antioch Review, one of the oldest and best literary journals in America. She also blogs on Huffington Post. She maintains an active website, piadejong.com, where she archives all of her writing in both Dutch and in English. And next January, she will publish a memoir about the year her newborn daughter was diagnosed with what was thought to be a terminal case of leukemia. Today, she will read selections from it and a few of her columns relevant to the water and the sea. I think all of you know this, but she also assembled the columns in this little booklet, which she calls the Mini Pia, that's on the table back there. And if you didn't already pick up one, please do. They're free. Then along the way, I will ask her a few questions, and then we will open it up for questions from all of you. And there will be some back and forth between. When she reads something, I'll probably ask her a question, and you can too. So it would not all be compressed just into the very end of her presentation. So, Pia?
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, and I have just one question. How many people are Dutch here? Are there any? Ah, that's what I like that, and you all speak Dutch. Yeah, that's nice. Okay, and I was preparing for this talk, and I thought, like, what's the first thing that comes into my mind thinking of Holland and water? And maybe you ladies know what poem would be the first poem you think of? No? Okay, I have this poem called Thinking of Holland, Denkend aan Holland. And it's done by a Marsman in 1937. And I think I want to read that for you because I like it so much. And it's voted poem of the century once. Thinking of Holland, I see broad rivers, slow and never-ending, flowing through the lowlands, lined with long rows of proud and thin poplars, like the tall plumes of a hat. And in the sunken space, magnificent, the sprawling farms scattered throughout the country, surrounded by clusters of trees, villages with knotted towers, ancient churches and elms, in a broad alliance. The sky there hangs low, and the sun is slowly being smothered in grey, multicolored dampness. And in all corners of the land is apparent the voice of water, with a constant loom of disaster, feared and heard by all. So that was the poem by Marsman. So I think talking about the Dutch and water is a great topic because, as you know, the ladies who are from Holland, Holland is mostly water, and what's not water was recovered from the water. So we are used to thinking water. And in preparing for this talk, which had the undertitle what we learned from Sandy, what we can learn from the Dutch from Sandy, I want to tell something because that happened when I just was here. So, the collective memory of the Dutch is the watersnoodramp, which is the big water disaster that was 1953. And no one in Holland, not even small kids, don't know what it is because as I did when I was small and my kids did when they were smaller, was giving a talk in school about this topic because it was such a big thing. Because what happened in 1953, Zeeland, that was in the west low part of Holland, it was full moon and high tide, which gave high waves. And what followed was destruction and death. And like many young men, my father went there immediately from Amsterdam to Zeeland to help carrying sandbags to stop the water from even flowing furthermore. And since he was a water engineer, he stayed there to implement the Delta Plan, which was the big plan to prevent this disaster from happening again. And thanks to this, I always felt safe. So my oldest brother was born in Zeeland, and after that, the work was done, and my father, who worked at Rijkswaterstaat, which is the government organ that works for the water, he moved to Limburg, which is in the south, and where we have mostly rivers. And but then I moved to America, and within a couple of weeks, a disaster was predicted named Sandy. And for some reason, the conditions were almost similar as those in 1953 in Zeeland. So it was high tide, it was full moon, and I was sitting there in my house that I only then discovered was totally made of wood. And I was surrounded by trees, and that was it. And I was alone with my 3 kids, and I was like, I've never been so scared in my whole life. And I thought, where do I hide? Because I was told that the cellar would fill with water. And at that time I wondered, like, why the hell did I leave Holland and subject my kids and myself to this disaster? Nobody ever thought that this could happen. And we were watching television and saw the New Jersey coast, these terribly high waves and filling the people and just these little shops, tear them down. And then what was even more scary, we saw New York, the water coming into New York City. And there was the devastating effect of water. And I think Sandy wasn't as terrible as it was predicted, luckily. But I realized nothing, no one was safe, and there was no preparation. So the following day, when Sandy was gone, the people counted their death. And there was a big page in New York Times with all the dead people. And it was like the book that I think everyone who's Dutch had in their home. It's called The Ramp, The Disaster. And it was always referred to as that disaster. And it had the little pictures. It was in black and white. And you saw the people on the houses, on the roofs in Sealand, and scared. And so there was I in this little wooden house in the woods, and I always wondered. And the anniversary now is coming up from Sandy. Why is it losing sound all the time? Oh, and so I wondered, and it was in the news, like, what can be learned from the Dutch? And I hope there will be something in the newspaper now 3 years later, what they did with it and what they learned from the Dutch. As Lenny said, we have, apart from a whole government system in Holland, we have a separate water management system where people vote for, like, it's the mayor. And indeed, like, my husband's last name is Dijkgraaf, which is the count of the dike. And they're very important people. And this is what I wrote about Sandy a year later. The stump of the tree was visible all summer, but now, with leaves falling, it's harder to find. It's all that remains of the stately sycamore that stood in front of my kitchen. It fell a year ago on an October night when Hurricane Sandy raged the East Coast. I'd arrived from Holland just 3 months earlier in the middle of summer. I'd left behind the old neighborhood where I'd lived for 20 years, all my friends, my irreverent neighbor, and hardest of all, my 80-something mother. My father had just died a few months ago. My parents had shared 55 years together. He had already bought an airplane ticket to visit me. My mother had clipped it to his photograph. I wanted to cancel the trip, but she insisted that I go. Indeed, I found so much to marvel about. Princeton, a small town in New Jersey, welcomed me and my family warmly. I enjoyed lazy afternoons in the garden, playing with my children. Then came an Indian summer that left us stunned with its beauty. All those warm hues, the yellows, the dark reds. It was warm enough to walk barefoot outside. Wasn't this the most beautiful fall we ever saw? Then came Sandy, heavy rains, howling winds. Don't worry, said our neighbor, who had lived here all their lives. It's never as bad as they predict. As Sandy approached the coast, we watched our TV huddled on the couch. We saw a frail reporter in a red raincoat holding desperately on to the railing of a pier, updating us in the top of her lungs. People who had not evacuated, as they had been told, tried to protect their beach houses, their shops with wooden barriers. This was not merely a strong storm, this was serious. The full moon and high tides added to a cataclysm that was sweeping west on the wind well over 100 miles an hour. I'm scared, Mommy, my daughter said, and crept closer to me. I was scared too. For the first time in my life, I had no clue how to protect my children. Never before experienced such a display of the raw power of nature. My children were jumpy and excited. I wanted to go outside to see for themselves what was going on. I told them to stay inside. We closed down everything, checked, double-checked again, and waited. Sandy visited our neighborhood only for an hour, but she made a mark as almost everything she touched. Afterwards, when it was quiet again, when the rain had stopped and the wind felt soft against our skin again, the sycamore was laying flat on the grass, its root hanging in the air, helpless, still alive, but not for long. We stood there, grateful it had not fallen on us, as also sad the tree had to die. When my daughter kneeled down to touch the wound, I saw tears running over her sweet face. That night, many people were killed. 2 of them were 2 brothers, the same age as my son, teenagers, who died when a tree fell on the room where they were playing. It still overwhelms me with sadness thinking about those kids. Now I rake up some leaves with my bare hands and smell the rich, sweet and sour aromas of autumn. Summer 2012 is definitely gone. A happy summer in which my sons grew stronger and taller. Their faces lost the last traces of childhood. Their voices are now deep. Using an axe, we take out the stump as well as we can, since we keep tripping over it. We fill the hole with dirt. There's some footsteps showing, and we leave it at that. Kneeling down next to it, I feel overwhelmed with awe and respect, the same way I feel when entering a graveyard. The old wound is now covered with moss that glistens on this hazy morning. Sandy taught me that life and death are incredibly closely bound. We never can be sure of anything other than the precious moment we are in. The wonder of this life manifests itself in splendor, large and small. A brown squirrel is playing next to me. When he sees me, he climbs up a nearby tree, his fluffy tail waving like a flag at everyone who wants to be greeted by him. Tears are welling up in my eyes, and for once I don't fight them. So that was my year after the Sandy, the year after Sandy. And, when I was thinking about how writing influences my, water influences my memory, I think there's hardly a memory which is not related to water. And I never realized it before I gave this talk, how much, how we are just, it's everywhere, the water. So thank you. I think you want to say something?
Maybe, perhaps we can go
Yeah.
over here. Turn off the mic.
Yeah. You're so far away.
I know, are you too far away? Would it be helpful if we move these chairs?
Yeah, maybe we can just stand there. Wouldn't that be?
We can move these two.
Yeah, we can just take it up and stand there, right? I mean, otherwise we're so far from.
Yeah, let's do that. You want to come down?
Yeah. No, we don't have. to
Yeah,
stand.
we can do this.
Yeah, we can just sit here. I mean, that
So
would
we'll
be
just
nice.
we'll just stand.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So, listening to you read your Sandy piece, I mean, I'm in a happy position. I read many of her columns in translation, and you were uprooted, and you arrived here, and you see everything fresh, with fresh eyes, and so things that we take for granted, oh, that's right, the video wants the mic.
I don't think it's on though.
Okay, are we on now?
Yeah.
Okay, good, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to ramble for a second. She sees things that we take for granted. And why? Because, well, she's new here, but she's been uprooted. And the process of being uprooted seems rather central to that of many writers. You think of so many writers, who have say, left America and written brilliantly else, but they need to leave. Hemingway, he goes to Paris, and Fitzgerald goes to Paris. And suddenly they see everything fresh, and they said being lost, and they kind of, it just arouses all their senses somehow and their perceptions. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. I think, yeah. So that was interesting. When I moved to Princeton, the NRC Handelsblad, where Tracy, who spoke before, also writes for, asked me to do this column, and I thought, maybe I do this for a couple of months because what's there to say? And then I came, and you see everything seems new. So suddenly there's so much a different way of looking at life and the little things. And now it's more than 3 years later, and I still see all kind of things that are different in Holland. So maybe in a couple of years, I don't know how long you live here, you kind of get used to it, but I'm not there yet.
I know, it was fun. She wrote one column about walking in the park and seeing a bench in the park with a memorial plaque on the bench, as you so often see here. And she asked, well, what was that? How could that be? Because in Holland, the parks and the benches all belong to the people, and you can't just go in there and put your name on a bench in the park. I find that's so charming and interesting. So I wondered that if you wanted to read something from your memoir. You said that almost all of your memories come from, have water and water in them. Did you want to read one of your chapters from there?
Yeah, I just want to read another piece.
When we played to that, does anybody have a question just by now?
Question, has there been anything like Sandy in your country recently? And is it just that your system of water management makes you prepared for hurricanes?
Yeah, we do. Yeah. So we have a whole system of, you know the tide, like here how heavy the storms are, and there's all preparations and there's like codes and you're told to stay inside, but it works very well and we are safe, I think, so far. Yeah, nothing happened, and even with high storms, and I think we have had one. I'm not really sure that this terrible, deadly combination of the high tide and the full moon, which for some reason get these really high waves that are so terrible. Yeah, like it's tsunami. Yeah.
I read a column not long ago as we were preparing for this event here. It was said the Dutch, to some extent, have turned their backs on the sea, maybe because the infrastructure around the sea is so big and strong that they've lost their awareness. There are fewer Dutch sailors than there used to be, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I read that article. I think what happens is that we are so safe, and there's also a certain amount of welfare and rich people, that the water now is mainly for for relaxation. So I think there are actually more boats, and lots of events, and the canals are all for pleasure boats, and it's getting like a tourist thing, Holland, yeah. Which, you just recently went there, and for me, I lived for 20 years in Amsterdam. I was there also the same time you were there this summer. It's like so busy, and there's so many tourists, and they all are on the water, and we have like, bicycle boats, and we have the most strange things to relax on the water. So
The water just becomes sucked up and is completely a part of Dutch life.
Yes,
no matter
it
where
is.
you are.
Yeah.
Perhaps you would read something from you.
Okay, I want to. Okay, I want to tell you something about Amsterdam, because that's where I lived, and my new book, my memoir, is all about the place that I lived and my kids were born. So Amsterdam, probably you all know this, but it's built in circles, and there's the canals. So in the middle is Dam Square, and it was done over time in the 16th century, and earlier and later. And the smallest of the canal is called the Prinsengracht, the Prince. Everybody knows it because that's the Anne Frank house. And everybody, I think I probably asked 1,000 times, where's the Anne Frank house? And because I was very close to where I lived. The other canal, the little bit bigger canal, is called the Keizer, the emperors. And then there's the Herengracht, the Gentlemangracht. That's where I lived. And it implies actually that the gentlemen were more important than the rulers and royalty. And that was exactly the case in the 17th century. And the Heren were the gentlemen, the men who made Holland big, the merchants, and the ones who imported the spices from the east. And I lived in the beginning of the park, of the Herengracht, close to a park which used to be the garden of the East India Company. It's a beautiful building, and actually what there's now is the America-Dutch Institute, where they give talks about the relationship between America and Holland. The house I lived in, the whole history of all the houses of the canal is kept. And so I could read about the house exactly when it was built, 1632. I didn't own the house, I just rented it. And so it was a merchant lived there in 1632 who imported cod liver oil from Greenland. And he was just a small merchant, but he got very rich from importing this oil. And they really got rich, and they could afford many things, and he was one of those who probably would have dreamt of one day having his portrait taken by a painter named Rembrandt. And so now what happened is the cod liver came on boats on the canal just in front of my house, and then it was, I don't know what the word is, takelen, so it was kind of, taken up and on the, okay. And then it was taken up to the 5th floor, which is still the 5th floor there, and that's where they they kept it before they sold it. So it sounds like a very strange idea to get these heavy things up to the 5th floor, but they still are very quick with getting. So when you walk through the town, and you see always a piano hanging, like that's it. How they did my piano. So nobody thinks twice of doing a piano on the 5th floor, and. One thing that's in the book about my house is that there were complaints in the 18th century that the 5th floor was still smelling like cod liver oil. I had all my 3 kids in the 5th floor of that house, also very high, with a midwife, which is a very Dutch way of getting babies. And if I tell that to the American, first time I told it to this American doctor, she thought I was just totally nuts, that you don't have a physician, you are on the 5th floor, and nobody thinks twice about it. I didn't even, because we all do that. And across the canal was the school of my kids. And you could either go there, so here was the house, here was the school, and you could either go like this bridge, or you go like this bridge. And then you would think like, can you leave and let kids go to school alone? And yeah, because we all teach our kids to swim. That was another thing that I was totally surprised when I arrived here, that many people cannot swim. And we don't allow kids to leave after 12, the school they leave when they're 12, without them able to swim. And because you have to, if there's water everywhere. Now, next to the school lived an old man, and every time I brought my kids to school, I passed his house. And I wrote a story, and I think that was the story that was my first story that was printed here, was about that man who lived on the canal. It was inspired by him, and the story is All That Is Blue. You found me, the old man in the knitted sweater whispered to me in a soft, hoarse voice. I wonder about the sweater, since this is one of the hottest days of the year. He looks out from the doorway of his old house beside the canal. I've just rung the doorbell to tell him that his keys are hanging in his lock, a cluster of different keys, crowded on a wrinkled brown leather trunk label. I still remember the hassle when I once left my keys outside in the lock and they vanished. I now notice that the man is not particularly old, he's just worn. He used a cane to walk towards me, yet when he creases, his creased face leans towards me, I look straight into his brown eyes. They're lively, glistening like grass on which rain has fallen all afternoon. The skin on his cheeks is pink, his lips a light purple. It could be my father's age, or rather his older brother. There's a strange familiarity between us, even though I never met him before. This was not so difficult, I say with a smile when I hand him the keys. He beckons me inside as he shuffles into the living room and gestures without looking at me to a huge sofa. I let myself sink into the burgundy velvet fabric and close my eyes. I hear noises in the house, old sounds of meat braising softly on the stove for hours, of champagne being uncorked. Muffled moans of lovers in the bedroom, uninhibited sighs, and children giggling in the attic. Yes, there must be an attic in the house. I feel slightly lightheaded. There is something about this place that feels like home. Not my real home, but the home I inhabited in my dreams since I was a child. Recurrent dreams of crude fabrics and warm colors and comforting sounds. I know that this will be hard for me to let go of this place. Maybe impossible even. After all, I've been longing for a place like this for so long now. You found me, the man says, again, and I wonder what he's trying to tell me. There's a wine glass on the table, with a hint of red right on the bottom. Next to it a container filled with yellow cupcakes. His sweater is pilled, his hair like silk thread. I feel overwhelmed by his presence. The way he looks at me, as if I knows my secrets. Secrets I don't even know myself. His physical presence makes me feel weak. Suddenly, I want so very much to touch him, to put my arms around him, press him close towards my body. There's all this blue around you, he suddenly says, with such certainty that it pains me. Would he want me to hold him as much as I want to hold him? I hope he will explain to me about the blue. The keys, I say. You must not let them sink and sit into the keyhole, you know. It's dangerous to do that. I do not walk past your house every day. You got lucky with me. He nods his head. He knows he got lucky with me. Or am I lucky with him? He then asks me to make some tea in his kitchen. Of course, I say. Why wouldn't I? I would take him forever with that cane, and I realize I long for some tea to soothe me. He watches me leave the couch, and I heat the water in his small kitchen. There are clean bowls in the cupboard, he says, pointing to a ledge in the wall. As I wait for the water to boil, I feel his hazy, heavy gaze resting on my shoulders. It's not a burden at all. Moments later, we sip tea with only a little wooden table between us. He then eats the yellow cupcakes one by one. Tell me all about the blue, I say, and I hope he will talk to me for a long time. It's today's light, he says. Look, and you will see. I look out of the window with the velvety dust hanging over the water. Tears well up behind my eyes. You are lovely, he says, lovely and sweet. There's a hint of seduction in his voice that does not trouble me. Still, I suddenly realize I have places to go, things to do. I better go, I say. That's a pity, he says, his brown eyes now glistening moistly. Your blue eyes agrees with me. Be careful with those keys, I say. I don't pass your house every day. That's a pity too, he says. When I leave, he softly closes the door behind me. I hear the latch click, the lock turn. It is painful to leave him there, alone in that house, with the lost sound of a bygone life. But the air outside wakes me up. It's cooler now. After a while, I stop to gaze at the dark water in the canal. It's too late for my appointment after all. I wonder about the man. I didn't even ask his name. I wonder if I would be able to remember which house it was. I suddenly realized that I will never see him again. The surface of the water trembles ever so slightly. I look closer. Maybe a fish rose to an insect, or a flycatcher skimmed his wings on the surface. My shadow flickers on the water, reflected by the light of a street lamp. Then I see something that catches my breath. My shadow is blue. Oh,
Exactly.
thank you.
That's such a lovely story. This was, what you read was the short story. It's fiction.
Yeah.
But I believe you've told me that is that now part of your memoir as well?
Yeah, it's now also, it's part of my memoir, yeah.
Yeah, and so there's a fine line, which you're not the first person to have to tread this, between fiction and memoir. And
Right.
I'm thinking, and some people practice both very well. Joan Didion, a writer I think you admire. I was thinking, I've been reading a lot about Vladimir Nabokov recently, and he writes beautiful, well, like Pia is a European who essentially came here, writes in English, and wrote beautiful novels, but also wrote a classic memoir, Speak Memory.
Memory, yeah.
And so could you just talk a little about that? So how does you saw yourself as a fiction writer, the memoir will come out in January in Amsterdam, in Dutch. Just tell us about that.
Okay, yeah, so that's one thing. So I started as a fiction writer, and then I was asked for the NRC Handelsblad to write this column, which was totally a new thing for me, because then I certainly had to be true, which is very confusing. And I made it a point that I don't make up things in my column. So everything I say, it's not. It's all through me, and then I started with this memoir, which I'm still talking to my publisher, which is Prometheus, also at the same canal, the Herengracht. And I'm not sure if it should be a memoir because it's not completely true. And although here a memoir is a very respected genre, I'm not sure if that's the same thing in Holland. And so I'm afraid it will be on a bottle of some pile. So I'm kind of trying to make it in a new category, something like autobiographical memoir, or it's always complicated. What is true, what is not true. It's probably poetically true. Yeah, so there you go.
Okay. Any questions at this point from you in the audience? I know you have several other things you could read, at least one more column, and then or you could or read another segment from her memoir.
Yeah, the question is my novel translated in English? Well, I hope so. So first, it's going to be in January in Holland. The title will be Charlotte. That's the name of my daughter, the one who was so sick as a baby. And then I hope if it sells well, they can sell it in Frankfurt, which is actually now, but then the next Frankfurt, and it will be translated. And if they don't do that, then I'll make sure it will be translated because it's pretty frustrating if you live here and nobody can read your books. Yeah, it's like I felt like I left my identity somewhere in a small country on the other side of the ocean when I came here, and nobody could read me. It was very frustrating. Yeah.
Water diffuse itself into the Dutch language? In other words, does the Dutch language have many more ways of expressing the term water and sea than the English language? Or has it impacted the language in that respect?
I don't think so. I'm not sure. Do we? Is it? Okay. Tell us. I think it does. It does.
Many expressions, but I think it goes back to the time where there was a lot of trade. The Dutch were like conquering the world. Trying to in the times of colonization. And, and we're in Amsterdam, still had a big port, now it's mostly Rotterdam. There's so many expressions in Dutch.
That's true.
But they really go back to the time of the big ships and the big sailing ships. So there's actually so many of them when you start paying attention. When you explain to your kids in English what the expression means.
Right. No, it's true, it's expressions. I was thinking like if there was like, as they say, which is probably not true, the Eskimos have all these words for snow, that we have all these words for water, which you know, but it's full of like really nice and funny expressions. Yeah.
I thought you told me at one point, or you wrote maybe, that the Dutch have many phrases to describe the light in the evening, and that is very much the evening light is sort of a water light. Is that right?
Yeah.
Americans say twilight and evening.
And then I researched, and it turned out that the Americans have the same amount of words. I just didn't know them. That's the other thing. You feel like a little child that, you're handicapped if you're from another country. You really are. You have an accent forever until you move here. Like my daughter, who's now 15, she moved when she was 12. She's the only one in my family who doesn't have an accent. She lost it because she was so young. And I, especially when talking to you're this writer, all these words, I just miss that. I feel I have to learn to talk again. And at this age, it's just very difficult. Yeah.
We want to read maybe the short column.
Okay. I have a column I want to read. It's very dear to me. I wrote it in Amsterdam, actually. It turned out my column would be in the Handelsblad on New Year's Eve. And this is about my mother, who so then there's Amsterdam, you have the canals, and then there is the water called the IJ. It sounds like egg, but you write it with an I and a J. And on the other side of the IJ, there is Amsterdam North, where my parents are from, which is actually, I think, was a very poor area, and they actually built it, and they, like for new people who were important, and there was basically nothing, and no theater, nothing, and there was like a little boat, a pontje, and that went up and down to Amsterdam North for poor kids like my parents who didn't have a school there, and so this is about my mother. And then parts of that freezes, and it's very hard to get to the other side, and the little pontje doesn't, sail. So my mother she jumped actually, and and now Amsterdam North, that part is of course a very trendy area with like the nicest restaurants, and they have their own theater, and it's It's very interesting. So, this is called Jumping into the New Year. I'm spending this New Year's Eve in my former home of Amsterdam. As the train glides into the central station in the rain, I look out across the river Ij, where the ferry arrives and departs. Storm clouds sweep over the black water. On this and every New Year's, I find myself thinking of another winter night 70 years ago in the middle of World War II. My mother was a little girl and lived right across the water on this same river. She was 12 years and wanted to be with her friends in the city, but because the river had frozen over, no ferries ran. What to do? The river was starting to thaw. The ice was cracking. But so what? She would cross those piles of ice, as beautiful, dangerous, and glittering as diamonds, to the other side. So she took a big leap from the bank and landed on an ice floe. I'm sorry. So she took a big leap from the bank and landed in an ice floe that wobbled scarily, soaking her. She jumped again onto another floating pile of ice, then another and another, again and again. I can see her in front of me, her two braids dancing on her winter coat, her flushed cheeks jumping faster and faster, her eyes on the far shore, which now seemed farther and farther away. She could easily have drowned in the frigid water. She made it to the other side, but as she told us later, when she climbed the embankment, she slipped and impaled her leg on a jagged shard of ice. The wound became inflamed, and she ran an infection in her bone marrow. Penicillin was not easily available during the war, and doctors had little time for civilians. She spent the rest of that winter in bed with a fever, while her parents feared the worst. But thanks to a resolute doctor's intervention, his procedure involved using a kitchen knife without anesthetics, she survived. But the resulting story was so harrowing that as a child, whenever I heard it, I covered my ears. Afterwards, I used to wonder, what if she had not made it? Then she would never have met my father. I wouldn't have been born, and neither would have been my two brothers. Even as a child, I'd already started to wonder about the capriciousness of life. How can we ever understand that who we are, what we are feeling and thinking, is determined by chance, good luck, or bad luck? So it is on this New Year's Eve that I'm reminded of this story my mother told me. We all stand on the shore of the past year, safe where we are, but full of desire for the far shore. We are like lovers who do not want to greet the dawn, but the new year turns us from the bed of the past. We briefly put off our pain by going to parties, singing Auld Lang Syne and kissing under the mistletoe. And then, with the brave smile of a 12-year-old girl, we make our decision and jump out into the perilous ice floes of the new year. So this was my mother, wanting to go to Amsterdam and hitting the ice. So that's the other thing. That's the other thing that I was thinking of when I was preparing for this talk, is that I was telling Lenny about the Elfstedentocht, which is the 11th city tour in Friesland, which is the northern part. So whenever there's a little bit of ice, we have these people, and they are with a stick, and then all Holland is watching, and they are looking how thick is the ice. And if it's thick enough, we can skate. And then we all go to Friesland and do this really difficult ice skating tour. But I think it's been more than 10 years that the last tour was done. We're still hoping for that. I think this was the columns that I did, and as Lenny said, they're all in the little booklet that you can take if you want, and which I did especially for all the people in this country who have no idea what I write about every week about their area, and for the Dutch there's the NRC. My publisher also made a little booklet, which is of course only available in Holland. And okay. Maybe Lenny,
Okay.
Some more questions?
I had one question, and maybe others do, and then I know you have one other piece of the memoir that you could read. As we read those two pieces, the short story, and where the blue of the water is sort of mysterious and deep, and it's hard to articulate what it is exactly. But then in the piece about your mom, that the sea, the water is an obstacle, and it's it's an affirming message that it's a danger, but a danger your mother overcame, and that's almost sort of what Holland's story is. It's a danger that they've overcome. Could you just tell me a little more about how you use the water in your writing? Is it a threat? Is it a mystery? Is it change? And the water changes, it freezes. Is it healing? There's so many different things it does, and I just wondered if you thought about that.
Yeah, I think I only became aware of how much water is in my writing in preparing for the talk. Because I think for the Dutch it's like a fish, I think, in the water. It's just, it's just very pervasive, and it's just probably everywhere. And it adds to the fun too. I mean, whenever the canals freeze, and the last time my kids were like small, and then we go on the. It's very funny if you can go on the ice in front of your and skate the little canals, and yeah. So yeah, I think and again, since this big disaster, I never felt unsafe with the water around me. Yeah.
Speaking of ice skating on the canals, am I the only person in the room, only American in the room, who thinks that Hans Brinker is really an ancient Dutch folk tale? And I was shocked to hear it's not. Yeah, they are so.
Yeah, so that's a.
I had presumed
Ancient,
that
yeah.
the story of Hans Brinker and the silver skates was written by a Dutch person, and was beloved in Holland and read aloud to children every night. This apparently is not the case.
No, that's a funny thing. Yeah, so nobody knows about Hansje Brinker, although, yeah, so it was an American lady. What's her name again? Who wrote the story? Yeah, and I think American kids know it, about the little boy who took his finger in the dike and stopped. And
So she apparently had never even been to Holland, right?
No.
She read about it
No.
or something.
And I think they put out a statue of Hansje Brinker, I think somewhere in Haarlem. I just researched because I think I should write about it, because it's so intriguing that nobody knows
That would be
about
a very funny column.
the little boy who put his finger in the dike. Yeah.
Okay.
How about global warming in Holland? Is that perceived as a major threat?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, we are afraid that the water will rise in canals, and oh yeah, it's a big discussion. Yeah, so that's the other threat where we cannot, not as Dutch alone, take care of, and we are dependent on the world, what the world is. Yeah, no, it's a big threat. So all these poems about the water will rise over the canal and overflow, and something to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk from experience. I moved here 21 years ago, and the winter before I moved, I lived in the south on a river, it's called the Maas, and so the water is coming from other European countries, and it just, because, Holland gets the water from, flowing to the ocean, to the North Sea. So the river flooded, and my house was on a little hill, and I think, thinking back of it, it was probably put on this little hill. It was part of like an estate from Barry. It was very funny. So our house was at one point sitting in the middle of the river, and the water and the ducks were just rushing by. And I remember going to bed, and I had a newborn, and it was Christmas, and it was like, okay, so tomorrow morning when we wake up, is it actually going to be in the house or it's not? And so that was and that was also. Is it global warming? Is it not? There was just too much water coming down the river at that point, and it's happened a couple more times, and they've made changes, engineering changes to the river, because it happened a couple more times back.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are changes happening.
It's true. I remember that story because we probably are from close. Yeah, and my parents' house also built on a hill, and it was totally flooded. And that's called what did you call the Uiterwaarde? So it's between the river and where the people live, and it's never been that high, and never been up the hill and flood the house. And my brother's house was close to Nijmegen, which is another city close, was totally flooded. So it was a big thing. And and you never know if it's global warming. It's hard to prove, but it's definitely something is changing. And how do you prevent these things? Yeah, I think they, I don't know. Yeah, another question?
On reinforcing dikes, making them even higher, and also the North Sea coast and the areas where there was determined a weakness in the barrier for storms and therefore the North Sea. They are reinforcing those areas and building up the beaches.
Okay.
They are doing something.
They're doing something, yeah.
Preparation for, before something happens, they want to prevent it from happening. And that's what I think they're going to try to do here as well. But when I came here, the whole area around Wayne, where I live, was flooded. I just couldn't believe it because the Americans, they can put people on the moon. But and it happened over and over after.
I think this is a common experience for the Dutch because we are so used that everything is just totally taken care of and very well organized. And you think, like exactly the same thought, Americans, they can go to the moon. And for instance, after Sandy, we were for a week living without electricity. And in Holland, first of all, we were, I think, never without electricity, and it would be repaired like this. And here, nobody... Yeah, that's the other thing. Then you learn that it's in a tree, and that it's just trees that's the other thing. They just fall down like nothing, and nobody... It's accepted. I think in America, the force of nature is accepted more than in Holland. We just think we can, and because we did that with the dikes, we think we can take care, we can control it. And here it's more laissez-faire. I was still confused that they just put up these kids, and the people who died in newspaper, and there was no much more thought about it. Just like, just apparently these things happen.
I would make the case that in America, historically, because there's always been a wilderness out in front of civilization, if things went bad, you could always move further away. You could just keep going. So if it got bad here, you just move out further west. And that went on for a long time.
Huh.
Do you have time to read one more thing?
Can we?
How's our time? Is our
Yeah.
time, are we okay time-wise?
Okay, so this was the last piece that I read. It's a little bit not that much related.
One piece.
One piece? Okay, so
You have more time.
yeah. Well,
Okay.
this is probably okay. So a little bit of introduction to this. So this is the memoir that Lenny already mentioned, and it's just a little piece about from the memoir, and so it's about my daughter Charlotte, and it's named Charlotte, and she was sick as a baby, and she recovered. She's very fine now. And now she's 15, and now I suddenly have this urge to write down what happened. And it's not about disease, or a specific disease. It's not like a medical book. It's just about how it is if you are in a situation that you suddenly have to deal with sickness and scary things. So she was born with leukemia, and it was immediately after she was born. So I was still this new mom who was kind of shaking from having given birth in this old house on the 5th floor. as it was a vaginal birth, as my midwife said. Are you sure? Yeah. So that's the other thing that Americans do like much more with cesarean sections. And no anesthesia, as I'm always proud to add, because nobody does that either. So now we know more, the oncologist began. It was 5 p.m. in his clean, well-organized office. He was a somewhat chubby man with a reddish mustache, which made him look older than he probably really was. Two medical students, thin blonde girls, who could have been sisters, even twins, stood in the other corner of the room, huddled behind a notebook. Is it okay that they are here? The doctor asked, looking toward the girls. I nodded. I was afraid that if I said no, that they would disappear. Somehow I thought they might turn into my guardian angels. I held my daughter firmly in my arms. She was limp from the anesthesia, looking paler than pale. Today we will discuss what is best for Charlotte, the doctor continued. His voice sounded flat, rehearsed, scripted. He wanted to do this properly. He knew it was important. He knew that the girls would take notes, and he knew that I would remember this conversation for the rest of my life. The air was thick as syrup. We are here to discuss the treatment plan, the doctor said. Then he told us about children who had the same disease. He unfolded one article to show us. There was a table in bold letters showing 35 children with that disease. Their treatments were mentioned, the drugs, the operations. Some made it through several treatments. Some made it till they were 2 years old, others till they were 8. None of them survived. I felt like a bird floating above the room, above the doctor, above the thin blonde girls with their notepads. Below me was the table with tea for me, a glass of water for my husband, Robert. I even floated out of my body, looking down at myself, a mother with a limp, pale child in her arms. My daughter moved. I recognized her movements. They were similar to those when she was in my womb. Her feet kicking against my belly. Slow shifts, then sudden kicks. Charlotte, I said aloud, and it was as if I woke up from a dream. It seemed as though she had told me her name. Through the closed window, I could see the meadows behind the hospital. Green open fields filled with the lush green grasses of summer. I could smell it. If I went there, the grasses would bend, then spring back with every step I took. It would be like dancing with my child in my arms, further and further away. At the end of the meadow, I would cross the highway, very carefully, and from there over the cobblestones and the asphalt sidewalks into town. Okay, it would take some time. As the darkness would fall, I would start running, holding her even closer to my body. I would reach the canal. I'd open the door of my house and climb the stairs, the 30 steps of the spiral staircase until I was in her room, our room, in that old house on the 5th floor. The doctor coughed. He tried to get my attention, wanted to know what I thought of what he was telling me. About what? I asked. The treatment, he said. What will we do? I searched for my bag, which I'd put on the floor near my feet, my red backpack with all the things I'd packed the day before, my toothbrush, my pyjama, her lavender knitted vest with the embroidered kitten, and zipped it shut. I put on my sweater. I put Charlotte snug in her sling. I kissed her and stood up, pulling my backpack over one shoulder. What are you doing? The doctor asked. I saw in his eyes that something was wrong. I'm ready to leave, I said. Leave? Why? He asked. Because I'm going home, I said. All 3 of us are going home. But we're here to discuss the treatment plan, the doctor said. Let's go, I said to Robert, but he already was following me towards the door. We stepped outside the hospital, and the sky became another roof over our heads. A breeze blew through our hair, and the sun warmed our skin, still tingling from the air conditioning inside. Charlotte calmed down and hiccuped a little as we walked slowly into town. It was high summer. Thankfully, we were once again just the 3 of us, the trinity that we had been since the moment of her conception. Charlotte blinked in the bright light and closed her eyes. No one stared at us here. We were an ordinary couple with a baby, cheerful parents who had escaped the heat in the house to take a late afternoon walk to find an ice cream cone. We settled on a bench and watched the boats floating by. A big boat full of students, a boat with a man with a captain's hat and a woman in bikini on the forecastle. A yacht full of champagne bottles. All the people were cheerful, all the boats sailed high on the waves. The wind filled our sails, the city laughed. I wanted to wed myself to the simple pleasure of a summer day in the sun, an ordinary couple with a new baby out in the city. It was a promise that has always been made and that it would seem always remain so. I wanted to be part of it. A few snatches of Ravel's Bolero floated from an open window of a large house across the street. A fully rigged sloop sailed by slowly. On the bow sat a girl in a tight white dress, flirting shamelessly with the man behind the wheel. I watched them until they disappeared from sight, and a new boat came into view. I could have sat there for hours. I wanted to steal time for the future and pulled it into this moment, this city, this summer, safe where I could find it and enjoy it forever. But now it was getting chillier by the minute. Evening was near. I knew I had to move soon, stand up, but I wanted to postpone that moment. It kept getting colder, too cold to stay. Night was falling. We were people of flesh and blood. We had to go home. We had to sleep, whether we wanted to or not, to face another day. Robert pulled me out of my daze, and I left unwillingly. My legs were asleep. My ankles were weak. My daughter was 2 weeks old, and I was 2,000 years old. And at the same time, I was a scared child. That was the part of my memoir. I just wanted to add, because it's a little bit unusual what happened, because at that time when we learned about that she had very little chances to survive, and that the only treatment was chemotherapy, which is kind of very scary, especially for a newborn, I instinctively, as I just told you, walked out of that hospital and thought, like, we want to be home, and if she needs to die, she can die at home. I just didn't want to be in the hospital anymore. And so we did. And for some miracle, she went into spontaneous remission. And that's how she survived. And then they researched it, and the doctor that helped us through this process, he's now a professor, and he did his PhD on her case, and it turned out that she actually survived because we didn't treat her. And she had this very rare leukemia that she kind of healed herself. And this is only for this case of leukemia. But whenever there's a child born with this form of leukemia, they are not treated. So something came out of this, very instinctively made decision. And and therefore we still have our daughter who just turned 15. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Steve, are we okay with time, or so we stop now, or you? Sure. It's here. You want to read the beach piece?
No, that's not a good piece. No,
Okay,
it's all right.
fine.
Okay, any questions? The lady, did you say something? You want to ask a question? No? Okay. Oh, you have a question.
As far as, have you been, your pieces are all experiences in the United States versus Netherlands. How much do you travel?
Yeah.
Because, if you're staying in New Jersey, it's one thing. If you travel outside of New Jersey, I'm sure there's going to be lots more.
Yeah, no, so that...
I
I know. Yeah, so you first said, pieces from America, which is not what I do. I write pieces from Princeton, New Jersey. So I confined myself to Princeton, New Jersey, and a little bit of the surroundings. Montclair is within the vicinity enough, so I can write about today. But the reason is I don't travel much because my kids are still small, and I write most of the time. So that's the small answer, and I'm totally aware that Princeton is not at all America, and it's very European, and this whole area, of course, is very European, and the Dutch settlement still, it's all there. And also, for instance, my husband works at the Institute for Advanced Study, and we're always joking when we have a dinner, where is the American? Because there's hardly ever an American. And
You have a token American every once in a while.
we have a token American, yeah. And it's very funny. And then we have this, for instance, like someone like Jonathan Israel, who is from the UK and who is specialized in America in the 17th century. So it's just totally not representable of. That's why I thought that I would only, stay here, do this writing for a couple of months. And but I have been traveling, and I'm totally aware that that this is, that America is just it's not a one country. It's totally, it's totally incomparable. Princeton to, for instance, the West Coast or something. Yeah. Yeah. What's your question? Yeah, so my daughter's 15, and I have a son, my oldest son, who just turned 19, and guess where he went to study 2 weeks ago? In Amsterdam. So, so he came in the second year of high school in Princeton High School, and he left his school in Amsterdam, and he already immediately decided that he would never study there. So he didn't even apply for a school here. He was just like going back to his beloved Amsterdam. And it was very interesting. He was the one who just called. I block it for everyone, but not for my kids. And it's very funny that he lives on the Prinsengracht, very close to our old place. And he just, it's actually, for him it feels he's back home. Then I have my second son, Matthijs. I give my kids names that nobody here can pronounce because I wasn't aware that I would move to... so my oldest is called Juriaan, and my second is called Matthijs. And the I is impossible, and the last name is Dijkgraaf, so it's too impossible names to to pronounce. And he is a senior, and he came first year high school, and he's more Americanized, so he is applying as well for American schools, colleges, as for Dutch. And I'm very curious where he will, of course, I hope money-wise he will choose to go to Holland and stay with his brother. And my daughter is 15 and just started high school, and she'll probably end up being the most American of the family. And yeah. Yeah.
Before you were saying how Dutch feel like they're they have everything under control, the water and the environment. And then you were talking about global warming and all these other new developments. Do you think that the Dutch feel like they're starting to lose control of the situation because of the global warming, because of all these other things, and that's changing the way they think about the water and changing the way they think about the environment? Do you think that that's starting to evolve, that whole attitude, or?
Yeah, so the question is, so the Dutch try to be in control of things, to, for instance, the water, they did a good job at that, and are they losing control now? And how are they reacting to this? I'm not really sure. I think a good example, of how we are is the Dutch are always very clean, and we always sweep. The first thing I ask, like when I came into the house, are the windows ever cleaned? And they looked at me like, the windows clean? So, like for instance, like my mother, who's old and she's not very rich, but she's safe to be able to pay for somebody who cleans your windows when you're old. And so that's how we are. We are very into details, and we have a very small country, so it's like easy to take care of it. And we don't like big changes. For instance, I think Holland is now totally into stress because we have all the influx from the people from Syria, and that's very upsetting for most people because it's in their backyards.
I spoke earlier about Tracy Nice, and she spoke about how the philosophy in Holland has changed in the sense that the Dutch are trying to accommodate the water, bringing the water in, opening up some of the dikes in certain cases, and reestablishing new habitats. And I'm wondering if that has to do with this slow evolution of attitudes. And they see that the Dutch are coming to the realization that this can't go on forever, and that because of climate change and these other things, that they can only control so much, and that they have to look at things differently. And that's the only reason.
Yeah. I wonder. I wonder. You have an answer to that? Yeah.
Well, I don't have an answer, but I think they are more, instead of fighting the water, just fighting the water and protecting, they learn to more coexist with the water. So make room for the water. There's a project called Room for the River, where they are enabling the river to go outside the banks if that were to happen. And it's only farmlands that would be affected, but not houses or places where cows and sheep would be. But they will take them on dry land, and then the river can overflow without wreaking too much havoc on people.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Like what they make.
But that's what I was
Existing and incorporating water into cities and into other places instead of fighting.
They know that if you retreat in one place, what will happen next time? The problem will just be down the street, you know, you can even know.
Yeah.
No, but I think the thing with the Dutch is that they have made money, you know, with the trades and the ships and everything. I mean, it was a way to expand and become rich in the past, but it's also being a threat to the country. And water is just always on everybody's mind. And I think global warming or not, they've always been in a position where they had to be scared of the danger of the water, because they have storms all the time. We have a Sandy, or we have a Floyd, or whatever it is, but there's storms all the time in the winter time because you're so close to the ocean. And I think they're always thinking about the water being a threat. While here, now people in New York are thinking about, oh, what if, you know, the tides are rising, what if? But there, it's just so part of, it's all, like you're saying, there's like separate governmental agencies that all what they do is constantly inspect dikes, think of what can go wrong, think of new techniques,
Yeah.
engineering. So I think that's a difference in approach, that it's not, they're not doing things because, oh, you know, maybe global warming is having an effect. They always be.
Yeah. So it's intrinsic in the way they approach all problems.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I just never, maybe that was because my father was the, this water manager for the Ministry of Water Management. You know, and my father was the big man, he was in control. I always felt like, you know, there's like grown-ups who take care of the water, and as you said, there are storms, and yeah, I never thought I would die from a big storm. It never occurred to me until I, you know, moved here and I had Sandy. So we have the Zuidwester, the big southwest storms that are really scary sometimes, and yeah. And we also used to, you know, we all bike through wind and storm. It's like this image of these women who just, you know, bike over the dikes, and they're really strong. And I mean, you don't care if it's. I biked to all my schools as a kid, and over the River Maas that she just mentioned, because my school was on the other side of the Maas, and I had to of course, it was terribly windy, and it never occurred to my parents to bring me, not even once, to school. It's just what you did, rain or snow. And yeah, I just never thought it would happen. And they warn you that when it's, you know, yeah.
2/3 of the country is below the sea level.
Yeah.
So if you that's what you tell you in elementary school, you have to believe it's safe. I mean, like, yeah, 2/3 of the country is below sea level, but we have dikes, and you know.
But otherwise, you'd always be afraid.
Yeah. Like when I first time I went to San Francisco, and I was like, oh no, you know, this big earthquake can happen, and I was like, what do they do to prepare it? Just nothing. Just when it happens, it's just bad luck. It's like, okay. I mean, the Dutch would do something against it, or maybe they would just evacuate the whole area or something. I don't know, but they would do something to. But the whole difference between, you know, that's with everything, and also with people always ask me about people being so poor in this country versus so rich. It's and the health care that we have very well organized. The thing is that we are a small country, and a small socialist country, so we it's just easier to organize it and to be in control. Yeah, I think that's the thing here. It's impossible.
I was going to make a PS on your comment about the floodplain and sort of living with the river, and it hasn't happened here much, and the Missouri River, I grew up in St. Louis at the junction of the Missouri and the Mississippi. And the Missouri River is completely channelized and dredged and contained, and mainly to keep the barges moving up and down the river. And that was because of economic interest, and we can get into that. But the problem is basically in Washington. But the current in the Missouri River now is faster, much faster than it was when Lewis and Clark went up and down it. So, and that's because there's nowhere to go. And so when there's a June, what they call a June rise, you know, with when the typical June rise, the water, much more water is getting crammed down that thing, and that's why, and then it eventually gets to New Orleans, where they were not ready for it, and so yeah, so we don't live with it. We're trying to fight it. I grew up in St. Louis. I never even saw the Missouri River because the whole city, the whole region just turned their backs and looked the other way while these barges were going up and down. There was no recreational use.
So yeah, that's what you said, make room for water. Yeah, that's the totally opposite. Yeah, accept it and welcome it, right? Yeah, just don't fight it.
Because I was born in Scotland, you would see.
Yeah.
I'm an estuary, came from the North Sea. And we had some idea about the sea, something similar to what you're talking about. The sea was there, we were part of the sea, so therefore we had to learn to live with it and accommodate it. I always thought about that. And as far as feeling safe and afraid, I felt safe and afraid at the same time. I almost drowned. We go swimming in the North Sea and they have these whirlpools. I almost drowned swimming as a child.
Yeah.
But it's the idea that this is the way the world is and we have to adapt to the sea, we have to adapt to the natural world. That's what we must do. So it's something that, I think it's something to do with the unknown.
Yeah.
I think when I live by the sea is totally unknown.
But do the Scottish teach their kids to swim at an early age? They do.
Yeah, all my friends knew how to swim. We had to.
You have to.
We had no pools to swim in. We swam in the North Sea, but we had to be good swimmers.
Right.
Because we get caught in these whirlpools.
Right.
But just like you run, you go to school on a bike, no matter what the weather's like.
You just do it. Yeah.
Snow, wind, dark, it doesn't matter. That's how I was raised. But I was also raised during the Second World War, too.
Yeah, there you go. So you know what fear.
I mean, when I went to school, I was 5 years old. They gave me a gas mask. And they told me, if you don't do exactly what you're told when you're told to do it, you won't be here in school over here. So therefore, we must do as we say, because when the German police came over, we had to be able to go into the shelters.
Yeah.
And my dog, it's so interesting. My dog, every day, my mother says, our dog would go to the door, and because we were so afraid when we came from the school, and then grade, and we wouldn't be home, so we'd be outside. And our dog came out to the street to help us. Steve.
Oh, that's so sweet. Yeah. Well, I think compared to war, then water is suddenly an easy thing, right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. If there are no more questions, you're a great audience.